I arrived at SACS in 1970. That was my standard 8-year. The figures don't add up, as you'll recall. That's because I failed standard 9. I'd come from a very tough school in the Eastern Cape called Graham College, where my contemporaries were notably brothers, the Watson brothers. For those who haven't really been following the South African unfolding, Gavin Watson was recently killed. He was involved in a massive corruption scandal. Was really the paymaster for Jacob Zuma. So in those days, you used to fag. That was sort of the public kind of school system, particularly in the Eastern Cape. In my class was a fellow called Cheeky Watson. There were four Watson brothers, and I just in my final year, the kind of school it was Cheeky had stolen the exam papers, and every single person in the class, standard 7 class, was caned. I mean, that was kind of routine. So that was it was a very tough, mainly farmers' sons, various retrobates. It was as I say, a very, very tough environment, very unsophisticated environment. And my parents, who was my father was in the construction business, road construction business, had settled in Somerset West, and he'd got a place at SACS, and that's how I arrived at SACS. Was a boarder, been booked into Rosedale, and it was a culture shock of the first magnitude to arrive at assembly on the first day with Boss Whitefoot. I'd never been exposed to anything like that in my life. I'd done at Graham, I'd done very well academically, but the academic environment at SACS was completely different. And as an adolescent, you kind of didn't fit in particularly, and it was a whole accumulation of things. But anyway, it kicked off on the first day of assembly. Whitefoot saying, "Now we need to decide what class you're going to, who's going to be your class teacher. So I want you to go and stand." Just for the time being, I think it was Mo Orford's class or Ralph Kelly at that time. I can't remember, but you know where the notices were placed. Just as you sort of face the school, on the right were two photos or two documents. The one was a picture of Beecham Proctor, VC, who was an illustrious SACS old boys who'd been a fighter pilot in the First World War. And had won the VC, and just below that was Jan Hendrik Hofmeyer's school report. I think at the age of 12 he matriculated, obviously with it. Anyway, Whitefoot he said, go and cogitate on these documents and consider very carefully how your the life of your betters. I don't quite know what. At the time, it was, the usual sarcasm and cynicism. So anyway, I went and I saw this fellow Beecham Proctor and Jan Hendrik Hofmeyer, who I knew nothing about at that stage. And that was my sort of introduction to SACS. The school, I'd taken Latin at Graham College. So, that kind of ended up, I don't think Whitefoot ever taught me Latin. But that was as I say, a complete dislocation for sort of a just post-puberty kid, and I had plenty of problems. I mean, of a personal nature. So I didn't attend to my schoolwork very well, but a boom and so on, and the result was the failing standard 9. Anyway, that was, and then Whitefoot I'd had a lot to do with, obviously, because I was at Rosedale, and he lived at Rosedale, so you'd see a lot of the guy. And then at the end of standard 9, in my second year, was obviously Graham College was a fairly rough and ready school. SACS was a very relatively, in those days, sophisticated environment. And that was the real, that was I spoke with a very pronounced Eastern Cape accent, and there were the kind of schoolboy environment was not great for an immigrant. A lot of the guys had been there since sub A in the junior school, and one just didn't fit in. And as an adolescent, that was very difficult. And I, as I say, in later life, it was you'd look back on these things and you say, well, it wasn't really an issue in the longer game. But you had a lot of bullying. You had a lot of in a sophisticated way. It was very difficult to come to grips with it as an adolescent. So that's. But eventually it one kind of settled down and fitted in, and it took a bit of time. But the irony was that, having then matriculated and started law, because I couldn't really think of any career, so I sort of stumbled into law, registered first year at UCT, and Whiteford and I really got on very well, but he was a bully, and he was somebody exploited his position, and he exploited usually with the irony, and he found it very funny. If you were the victim, it wasn't so funny, unless you had a fairly thick skin, of some of our contemporaries had. But anyway, Whiteford had left. Patterson had come on board, and it was a sort of relief to be rid of this affliction. And in those days, when you studied law, you had to, as you recall, do Latin 1 at university. And I couldn't believe my misfortune on the first day of my Latin class to be confronted by Whiteford. And he, we knew each other well, in the sense that I wasn't the greatest Latin scholar, firstly, and secondly, I'd been under him for 3 or 4 years at Rosedale, and of course I knew exactly how all of this was going to play out. And within the first 3 minutes, he said, Woodland, I see we are in each other's company again. Please, will you? And it was some unseen translation of the Gallic Wars or some crap, and this was you could see this delight at having the foil. And of course it was a very different environment, because you had 30 or 40 kids. This wasn't SACS. These weren't schoolboys. These were grown people. There were women. There were elderly people in the class. But anyway, I managed to fail Latin at university the first time around. I think on the second or third attempt, I eventually managed to get Latin. And in those days, it became a problematical, because I actually only passed Latin, which I thought required particularly close scrutiny, I think 5 or 6 years. And I only passed Latin eventually, I think, when I had to find a career. And as an advocate, you had to have Latin 1 as a subject. So that was my sort of introduction to SACS initially. I strayed a little bit. So it wasn't a great surprise to me, because we lived in this close environment. I think in those days you were allowed out 2 weeks a term. You could go home. You could actually go home. You could, in fact, you were not permitted to go down the road without special permission. So it was a very artificial environment. But I was sort of a bit rebellious, but not in a not in the league of some of our colleagues at the time. And but we always had a good rapport, and I think it didn't really come as a big surprise. But as I say, there was a completely new dispensation when Patterson arrived. He was the very antithesis, I think, of a guy like Whiteford. He wasn't academic. He had a bit of a drinking problem. Not that indicates any character flaw on his side, but he was a bit dim, and he was an apartheid apparatchik. So all of those things, which by then it was a fairly liberal environment that Whitefoot cultivated. I think that was one of the very positive aspects. But so that was kind of stumbled through through our 1973 year. And then in those days, the army was something which was on the horizon. If you recall, it was when we left school, it was a 9-month stint you had to do in the army. The army was relatively neutral in those days. I mean, certainly from my perception. But then in the first year, in 1974, that's when the trouble started to happen. Angola fell, Mozambique fell. The army, PW, it was the heyday of PW Botha. The army got involved in Angola. And then I remember sitting on the jammy steps when somebody said, oh, by the way, because you'd got deferment in those days as a student. Nobody really, even though it was only 9 months, nobody really relished the idea of being fucked around by a corporal for 9 months. But I remember sitting on the jammy steps and being told that they've just upped national service to 12 months, which was which we were all aghast at. Very shortly after that, it was up to 18 months and then to 24 months. So this miserable thought of at the end of your degree having to end up in the South African Army for 2 years, which is exactly what happened. I managed to defer it for a further year by I had a bursary from the Department of Justice, and so I managed to get myself a post as a prosecutor for a year. But ultimately, at the end of that year, they said, no, you've now got to do your duty. But I'd also, with uncanny luck, I'd been called up to the Navy, which in those days was regarded as the soft option. It had a very, very strong Royal Navy influence at that stage. And they weren't. It wasn't soldiering in the ordinary sense of going to the border or any of that stuff. And in conscription campaign, wasn't really. It was sort of just coming into life at that point. But anyway, I thought, look, 2 years in the it could be worse. So I served out 2 years in the relative comfort of Simonstown as a legal staff officer. So that was, and then having to decide what to do with my life after that. I had a law degree, no experience, no real idea of what I wanted to do. And I think very much as you indicated, Andrew, the kind of epiphany, which I'm sure I would have experienced had I been exposed. I mean, I didn't, other than having been a prosecutor, I had no idea what the law involved or how desperately boring it could be. Particularly, I mean, in my worst nightmare, I would my worst nightmares would have been realized had I been plonked in an attorney's firm. But I didn't. I knew no better, and I had this goddamn bursary to pay back. And I was looking for articles, and at that stage, accountancy articles were paying double what legal trainees were being paid. And in one of the great misjudgments of my life, I then joined a company called BDO Spencer Stewart, which is a large international firm of accountants, and was bored to death for 3 years. That was the sort of traineeship. But at the end of that, I couldn't see myself being an accountant for the rest of my life. And there was only one option, and that was to come to the bar. It was very much smaller. Now it's become highly professionalized, as you probably know. But in those days, you could cut a living with sort of with character and with and that's how I ended up at the bar, and where I have been for the last 35, 36 years.
What's your line?
And then amazingly enough, in those days, so I came to the bar in about 1985, 86. And you'll recall in those days, we still had the death penalty in South Africa, and the death penalty could only be imposed by the High Court, and anybody facing the death penalty was entitled to legal representation. And so who were the legal representatives? They were the most junior members of the bar in what were called pro deo defenses. So you arrived at the bar, that's where you cut your teeth. So some poor guy, invariably black, facing the death penalty would have as his representation the most inexperienced, youngest member of the bar. But it was a good, I remember on one occasion having a client having the death sentence imposed by a notorious hanging judge here in Cape Town called Bram Lateghan. And that made a very big impression on me, because P.W. Botha was still the president at that time. And this, I argued his appeal before the Supreme Court of Appeal, lost that, and then asked for, we then applied for clemency from the state president. That was the only way to avoid, the ultimate event in Pretoria Central Prison. And I recall vividly making application to the state president for a stay of execution, pending making a formal application for clemency, to have the death sentence converted to life imprisonment. And as a young advocate, I remember working all night on this application. My wife doing the typing, because you couldn't afford a typist as a sort of first or second year member of the bar. And we had a system where if you didn't earn any money, you didn't you didn't eat, type of thing. And my wife was working, supporting me. Anyway, we put in this application for a stay of execution. He was due to be executed the next morning at 6 o'clock, which is the sort of time they usually did these things. Dealing with the family directly, and perversely, the senior law advisor to P.W. Botha, who's one of my colleagues now, said, "Look, it would be a great injustice were the death sentence, the hanging, to be delayed, because it would give him a false hope." And I mean, that epitomized to me the kind of environment we were living. And he was duly executed at 6 o'clock, and then having to explain, to the family, because the legal representatives were notified shortly afterwards that he'd been certified, he was dead, and the state pathologist had verified that the sentence had been of execution had been conducted, and it was really something that I think made a big impression on me. But those were the bad old days. But when you think about it, it kind of you in the time and you in the environment. It didn't seem as bizarre as it when you think back on it. Talk to some of your younger colleagues. So I mean, this is how things happened. It's unfathomable to the normal mind. And my sons accuse me of telling war stories, but that was the way it was. For those, we've come a long way. I think we've come the wrong way in many ways. We have a very liberal constitution, but it's very difficult not to be a pessimist, as I think a lot of people are. And I think Carl van Hout, in his speech at the dinner, really kind of emphasized that it's still a very dysfunctional society I think we live in. But what I was going to before I went off on the tangent, so at the beginning of my career, I had a very, very profile murder case in which I was representing, strangely enough, not white Afrikaner boys who'd been accused of murdering his parents, called the Toy. And in those days there was a very strong print media. That was before the Cape Times eventually collapsed, and particularly to the sort of Afrikaner community. Anyway, this thing ran for days and days and days. Massive media. And eventually I got the one kid acquitted, and by the most remarkable coincidence, ran into Bedford, who by then I think might still have been at UCT, cafe just in Main Road, Newlands. He lived just opposite in his retirement, in a block of flats. It was almost as if kind of he then got chatting to, and and he had as you know, at SACS there were only 3 professions which were acceptable. So from his perspective, you could either be a medical doctor, you could be a lawyer, certainly couldn't be an accountant. And what was the other one? I think that was the way. But he kind of it's as if a dam had broken, and he started confiding these most amazing kind of personal reminiscences. That he'd come from a very poor environment. He'd always wanted if he'd had his life over again, he would have been a lawyer. He'd obviously not funds or the means to do that, and he'd had to become a school teacher. You think back on it, I mean, he was a frustrated lawyer because all the techniques used against schoolboys were those which are in a lawyer's armory. Sarcasm, cynicism, belittling. I mean, I say that against myself, but those are all the kind of court one would use, and that made it sense to me. And then we'd have these, we lived just around the corner near the Newlands rugby ground. When I'd go to the cafe to get my newspaper, I mean, I'd always run into Whiteford, and we'd have these long conversations, and it almost seemed to me to be a little bit pathetic if I look back on it. But that was Whiteford. And then I suppose I shouldn't doubles, but he got into trouble at UCT. That's Whiteford. Predilection for his lady students. That was all hushed up. And the time that we actually, that must have been, I suppose, 76, 77, 78. Then urgency there was in that, I don't know, but that was, that came from, my source seemed to be fairly impeccable. Was one of the victims of a lady victim of Whiteford. Yeah, I mean, he was obviously, I don't think it was anything at the time, and it was anything unusual. I mean, university lecturers, I think, have always. I mean, it's not an uncommon event. University, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, the lecturers would have an eye on the lecturers, on the younger. Exactly, but that's. I mean, I think he was a lot older. I mean, I did my majored in English, and I mean the English lecturers were notorious, but they were much younger. I mean, and it didn't strike one as strange, but certainly the Whiteford situation was very strange. Yes, I think if I look back on it now, and I mean, I've had discussions. I have a very close friend, Ian Fullerton, who was head prefect of SACS. He's now in Sydney. I mean, we've chatted about this over the years. I mean, he'd also dropped a year. He started business science, and then he did law. We became very close friends as well since university days. And I mean, we've talked about this often. And I think, in one sense, you're right. That was his ambition to become the head of SACS. But I think only when life had forced him in a direction which he had to take. I know the background, but he certainly said if he'd had his time over again, he would have wanted to have done law. And from Ian that that he'd come from a relatively poor background, and his parents, that's all his parents could afford was to I think a BA, and then he did an MA. He's with a, and I think he'd also missed the Rhodes Scholarship. There's something about that which you recall saying, because I don't think he wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, and that might have unlocked, for him a different path. I say, take that frustration. I mean, there's no, in retrospect, but he did a damn fine job, I must say. And I would, I think we were very privileged and very lucky to have had somebody as cerebral as he was, and I think with the values, for his time, the assembly, which, Mr. William, what was his name? Stanley Williams. And remember when, and he used to, I mean, somebody was remarking at Rosedale, but it wasn't so much as a Rosedale thing as a school thing. He'd say, well, remember the people who get up at 4 o'clock in the morning for breakfast and give you, to clean the classrooms. They're not as privileged as you are. I mean, that was a sort of something which he used simply as go to the ant thou sluggard, So there, and it's actually very, I mean, in small ways, I remember Rosedale. So you kind of had you didn't go to church, but you had a sort of church service in the Hofmeyr Hall. When I think back on it, it was a kind of, obviously not the Jewish fraternity, but the Christian fraternity at that stage, and I don't think there were any Muslims. It's not at that stage at SACS, but the kind of interdenominational, which he'd get along, were enlightened, and that must have been choice. And strangely enough, the one got along, I forget his name now, was from the Afrikaans Dutch Reformed Church. And, he was extremely liberal and was in fact assassinated about 15 years ago because of his political views. So I think of that must have been, that kind of exposure, certainly something orchestrated by Whiteford, and that. And it was a small thing of not kind of getting the intemperate apartheid type line on things. I mean, he'd obviously gone out of his way and I remember that, because even as a schoolboy, he's kind of, on a Sunday morning as a alien, sort of kind of being exposed to this. Fairly enlightened views at that time struck a chord. So that was the sort of guy Whiteford was. I mean, I think he was he was open-minded, and made a very, very big impression on one's life. And I mean, those kind of which he used, one shouldn't admit this, but I mean, that's the kind of courtcraft that you developed. The debating society, sarcasm, and the irony, those are all techniques, which employed to great advantage subsequently in life. And I suppose if you talk about SACS now, you talk about Boss Whiteford. It's the whole. I mean, I think we had a very unique year, or a unique time. I mean, you think of the Mo Orford and Doodles the Cock and Kelly, and I mean, they were people, eaten people, and I think rubbed off to a large extent on certainly the colleagues that kind of, not that I've got too many of this. There's still SACS boys at the bar. I mean, Rose Innes, Goodman, were a little bit below us at SACS. There's a very, I think, a formative, one couldn't have wished for a better formative kind of experience. Although in hindsight, I mean, it was really about it. I mean, we were kind of a privileged place. but at the time, I think a great formative experience, personally.
You said, now again, you knew Patterson much better than any of us did because you were in your position.
Yeah.
And you know that he was an apparatchik and not that bright. Do you think when Patterson was appointed, there was a groot skok in the school? Everyone was, what? Everyone thought John Ince was going to be the principal and blah, 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 blah. And it didn't happen. And then Patterson came along and looking at him as, through the Whiteford lens, and what the fuck? And I agree with your sentiment about him being not that bright. And I didn't know about the apartheid apparatchik. Do you think that was a deliberate move by the education department to do something about what Whiteford was doing at the school?
It was in response to Whiteford, may well have been, because he'd been an inspector of schools at some stage, which that he was with the National Education Department at the time. So that's the inference I draw. But not I think as close as I was to Whiteford, but at Rosedale, he didn't have any wider general knowledge. He didn't have that academic sophistication that Whiteford had. So, and then, as you say, you saw through the lens of Whiteford. So there was a bit of resistance, my perception against him, sort of really not being a worthy successor of Whiteford. And, I don't think, other than perhaps seeing him at an old boys' dinner maybe once or twice, never set eyes on the man again, He was very close to the Department of Education. That I do know. So whether that was in response to Bonda in the salon saying, look, this is not working out, Whiteford, who's put his liberal ideas into kids' heads, is not a great idea.
Of course,
that was the way that it operated. It's difficult to, and I, sort of came to see quite a lot of, because, at this end of the legal profession, you see a hell of a lot of that sort of, and, I spent 2 years as a staff officer in the Navy, and you kind of get a sense how things work, and I think people don't really understand the level of control exercised over every facet of one's life. Just to go back to something which I remember Whiteford, he told the joke quite, and it kind of portrays his sort of leanings. John Foster, who at that time was the state president, a brother called Kurt Foster. He was a high cleric in the Dutch Reformed Church, and he would say Kurt Foster was known for his brusqueness and lack of sophistication. Say, well, Kurt Foster, who was the moderator then of the Dutch Reformed Church, who carried his own china shop around with him. So, but that kind of, that was a kind of joke made in public, really, about the brother of the sitting president. Probably was probably quite a significant thing to say as a headmaster of a large and well-known school. He had other, and so Whiteford at Rosedale on a Saturday evening, it was a kind of ritual. He'd go down and buy the newspaper for the boys on a Saturday evening who wanted the Arts, as it was called in those days. It was a good newspaper, and so this kind of sojourn would usually take place at about 8 o'clock at night. The reason being that sports reports and so on were in the late August, and we're down to in Newlands in Dean Street, which is still there. And so that was something that I'd done, I think, from my standard 8, standard 9 year. And so you'd have these kind of really intimate chats, in the forced on you, because you'd have to be sitting in his motor car making small talk. But he certainly in those kind of chats struck me as a liberal, humane. His humanity, you can't, I think there was a very humane streak. And they tell stories. There was a fellow called Sturton, James Sturton, I think his name was, who out of Rondebosch. He always told me that, how unjustly he thought Sturton had treated at Rondebosch, and gave him a home at SACS. And also Rosedale. I mean, I sort of personal experience. I went through aberrant adolescent stage, so I think I'd run away, and there was called to above us, John Henry Morgan, I think his name was. Anyway, ran away and hiked up to up the coast, and then to compound, we got busted, and we'd been smoking dope, and my parents went ape shit at all of this and said, no, you've got to, I said, you've got to tell the headmaster about this. So my parents came to learn of this lot, and involved in this was dope smoking and all the rest of it. And they said, now you've got to, you've got to go and tell Whiteford, first of all, explain your absence from school, and secondly, that you're a fucking confirmed drug addict. Drugs, Dacha had that kind of, certainly my parents were not sophisticated, broad-minded people. So anyway, I thought, oh fuck, here we go. Anyway, so they ended up about all of this, and I remember him calling when I got back Rosedale. I think I was in about, it was my standard 7 year, which was the reason I failed. It was standard 7 or 8, maybe the first time around. No, it was standard 8, not the first time around in standard 8. I remember Whiteford calling me into his room at Rosedale and saying, look, this hullabaloo going on, but if you promise not to carry on with this, and you yourself diligently to your studies, well then, we'll all not speak of this again. Fucking thought, I thought, shit, smoking weed, this was significant. I mean, I'm not a great weed smoker, but one did these things, and I thought, oh fuck, here we go. That was the end of that. No more was said. I think that was a very humane response. I mean, you can, in the culture at the time, what would have happened at an Afrikaans fucking school. I mean, they were called in the drug squad. They would just do a fucking boys' school for rehabilitation fucking school in Pretoria somewhere, and a complete, as I said, fairly unpredictable but humane response. It's a sort of, and I've got, you've got to admire the guy for that. He had he was a very humane person.
Later, he made you head boy of Rosedale.
Yeah. So that was the astonishing thing, really.
Something in you, Gavin. He must have seen something in you that, I mean, honestly thought after formed his word that you then cleansed yourself, as it were, of your sin.
No. I mean, as a prosecutor, I mean, you were a couple of things that you had. You had the Terrorism Act. You went to jail for 25 years as sort of minimum sentence for what was, I mean, for any kind of a infraction of a slightly political nature. And the other one was the Drugs Act in 78. I mean, this, and as a prosecutor, I remember this fucking draconian law. Your cops would be salivating if they found, and there was assumption, I mean, if you had over 300 or 400 grams or something, you were deemed to be a dealer. which was a 15-year jail sentence. You know, I mean, that was all the, all the psychosis of the time, with drugs and terrorism and stuff. Didn't, I mean, I remember enough. I mean, people won't, that they won't believe, especially the youngsters now. Certainly in my final year law class, I used to hang out with a girl who's now a judge here, Shinaz Mir. She was Fatima Mir's daughter. Got a special license to be at UCT, which was bad enough. So days, the end of the year law dinner took place at some hotel, some venue. She wanted to attend. See vividly, she was going out with a guy called Joe Kricher, who was also in the law faculty. Ian Fullerton, myself, and one or two others had our own party at the Southern Till in Road, Newlands, because they had a special license, an international license, as it was called in those days, where people were allowed to have a meal. I mean, people, maybe it's a function of our age, but I mean, that we grew up in an environment like that. It was just, thinkable. And that was 5 years down the track from 1973 on. I mean, and when I came to the bar, I mean, it was just on those sort of early political cases. We had what was called a state of emergency, you'll probably recall, in those days. And the defense fund would again pay for legal representation. And one going off to Craddock, and this was about the time of the Craddock Four. So the security police were very active in the Eastern Cape, in particularly Craddock. And youngster had been was being charged under emergency regulations, or being held under the emergency regulations. He'd been held for like 3 months for distributing what this sort of incendiary pamphlets on. Anyway, eventually I got briefed to travel up to Craddock, and in those days, because the budget was thin, you'd kind of have to fly up, and you didn't have any instructing attorney. You'd fucking 2 or 3 hours to Craddock. And it was, and I still think to this day, kind of how that epitomized, where society had got to. So he has a Afrikaner regional court magistrate. He couldn't have been more than 17. He's fucking been held for 3 months for having been caught with sort of pamphlets. 3 security policemen sitting in the court, all from central casting, fucking short pants, safari suits, long socks. I mean, that was the, you think, the kind of what's the word I'm looking for, of security policemen, the archetypal, but that was what they were like. And that in front of this Afrikaner magistrate, who made me speak Afrikaans, he wouldn't allow me to address the court in English. And then, I started off by saying, look, I just want to draw to your attention. My client's been assaulted. He's all fucked up. His eyes blue. He's got fucking abrasions all over his face. Saying to me, no, he doesn't see. He doesn't see what I'm talking about. And by the way, am I a doctor? That kind of shit. And so, that was a kind of which one had to go through at the time. And that was, as I say, that was still very current. I mean, that was within years of matriculating. Or the little I know certainly wasn't learned at university. I mean, that came later in life, when one had to, when one had to earn a living, when the reality dawned that that you had to find a job and you had to fucking earn an income, otherwise you starved. In my early days, just as a means to, these paid briefs by the state to defend, and then as the Defence and Aid Fund, which was an overseas funder, mainly for, in relation to apartheid offences, criminal infractions of the security laws and that sort of thing, which eventually I think got banned in any event. So they funded a lot of those criminal defenses. And as a young lawyer, I mean, that was, you felt, I think, exploited as an advocate, because the attorney would collect the money and then send the advocate off to, where it was, to Paarl or to Craddock or to sorts of places. So that was the only law that I really did. I mean, that was my early days. But basically, corporate law, was my sort of area. And fundings, in fact, also perhaps attributable to SACS, because I'd done my accountancy traineeship, and I came inside, kind of had a fairly good grasp of, accountancy and that type of thing. And I basically moved in that direction because of, skill I had in that area. But my I got here was up by who was then the head of a firm here called, in those days, called Sonnenberg, Hoffman and Golombek. They were the first players in certainly in Cape Town. They're now a firm in Africa. But even in those days, I mean, they were massive players, and they'd keep you alive as an advocate if you got into their briefing books. And I got a telephone call. I mean, I'd been at the bar for no more than 6, maybe 8 months. Had own chambers, smallest chambers in the building here, Huguenot chambers, which is still the main sort of repertory of advocates. To say, can Mr. Golombek, that's Arnold Golombek, who was a prodigious here in Cape Town at the time. He was head of the Jockey Club and the establishment, not to say the Jewish establishment in Kent, and obviously was the man in charge of Sonnenberg, Hoffman and Golombek. Could Mr. Golombek make him to see you? Now, and this threw me, and I think probably with malice of, it was a Friday, I remember, so probably with malice of forethought, I took the precaution of wearing my SACS old boy's tie, because the Golombeks was in our class. Son. Anyway, so Arnold arrives, this guy, I mean, who it seemed unbelievable to me. But anyway, the long and the short of it was his secretary was having maintenance difficulties, and she had to appear in the main court, who was bringing some maintenance application, Weinberg Magistrates Court. Anyway, the first thing he said was, "Are you a SACS old boy?" Which obviously I was. And that, certainly for a number of, in fact, still, that seemed to open a golden path for me at the bar, because whelmed with from Edward Nathan, as they now called, then called Sonnenberg, Hoffman and Golombek. So that was the boys' network certainly very beneficially in my favor. And never quite a school like SACS. I mean, bishops, my two sons to bishops. Education is probably, well, mainly for the very pedestrian reason that we live in opposite the bishop's gates. So it must have saved my wife, Kristen, thousands of hours of commuting. The boys just had to walk over the road to school. I mean, that was really the primary reason. But that kind of education is very entitled, very privileged. It's a bought education with everything that, every kind of extramural facility they ever want. But against, the breed of, by and large, obviously not through, the product is school preppy type product. When we came from a very much more pedestrian, intense kind of that, because there's still, that kind of private school stigma is a very stigma. Certainly in the professions now, of course, it's different, because you've got a very environment that is a very different complexion. So those things by other things, not not by your private school education. It was I think a great education, and a great I think for people, it certainly for me set one's life. The kind of people who are involved. I mean, you've got Lenny Hoffman, effectively the Chief Justice in England. What was Zuckerman? I mean, these were people who, I mean, people like Albie Sachs, to breed up the people of of a basic, with sort of basic humanity, basic decency is the word I'm looking for. That maybe speaking as we look from the perspective of what 60, 65, 66 years. A lot of, I've just, in fact, a guy who was also at SACS, strangely enough, who I worked a hell of a lot, a guy called Sean Fergus. I mean, his age, who's now just also to Australia, which is perceived as the for lawyers who want to get out of the system. Say, I mean, you kind of, that's what kind of bred you to entitlement, but you just assumed it was the natural order of things. Living, for the rest of my life. I obviously had a law degree, but it was much smaller, but it was still a fairly, as it is today, a fairly exclusive club, if you like. And if I think back on it now, sort of 36, 37 years ago, I must have been fucking mad. No forensic experience other than a year executing experience. I'd been a staff officer in the Navy, which doesn't really count as legal experience. And so I arrived here the fucking day, said I wanted to be an advocate, pupillage first, that means passing the bar exams. I realized that I'd squandered a lot of my time because I had a wife to support. I had to earn a living. I didn't from a family with any money or anything. So I thought, fuck it. Now you've got past the bar exams, the most difficult fucking months of my life. Pupillage in those days was 6 months to pass this fucking bar exam. Yeah. So, I'd realized I was in over my head. I had to fucking work day and night to pass this goddamn exam, and then start appearing in court. I mean, before these sort of granite-faced, and I said, fuck it, I must have been crazy to, at that age, still in my 20s, I think, or maybe early 30s, against the kind of these names you only read about in the newspapers, that you'd fucking get in that kind of environment without any sense of embarrassment or serious trepidation. I mean, obviously, it's it's with nerves, but it was, I just think back on it now. It was just kind of, well, that was the way it was ordained. You felt comfortable. It was a culture. You were equal to any intellectually. You could read, you could write, and those were the sort of attributes. But back one thing just that occurs as just while I was looking. Don't keep a lot of paper life, but I was just looking through that little pile of documents that I do have. UCT, first year I'd spent in digs. Second year, my parents said, no, look, there's drinking and smoking and your budget here, you've got to go into residence. That'll fucking sort you out. So then I was booked. My parents, who were still paying my university at that stage, then got me in a residence called Leo Marquardt. That was that big, those big sort of round towers. And at that point, I was heavily involved with Varsity, Bloch, who just died recently, was the editor of Varsity. He got banned for being, and I think Michael Canty was at one point also involved with Varsity. Anyway, so they invited John Foster, who was the president, to come and at Leo Marquardt. And Leo Marquardt was a great liberal, as you know. So then, certainly with the enthusiasm of youth, I thought, no, fuck this. We organized a protest at the time. The sort of chairman of the House Committee at Leo Marquardt was probably a security policeman by the name of Reggie Prosh. We organized this demonstration, which sort of had our pamphlets and running kind of articles in City and that sort of thing. But with the recklessness of youth, could have fucking known what the predictable response to all of this shit would be, you know, namely a visit fucking 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, by the fucking security police. So I was taken away, not probably in a day. But, my parents at that point said, no, fuck this, we sent you, you know, we're paying for you to go to university, not to fucking protest, because it got quite a lot of publicity in the press afterwards, you know, that they had been subjected to these sort of demonstrations. That was my allowance cut off. Really had to fucking start how I was going to pay for this lot. But you know, think back on that. This, you know, students taking on John Foster. I mean, in age of fucking, how old were we at that point? 23, 24. You know, and it was, you know, you had a white skin. You were at a university. You had a semblance of a free press in this country, so you were basically protected. You know, if you were of a different fucking racial profile, that would have been the end of you. And or if you were a real threat, simply making a lot of noise at a speaking engagement, they fucking chucked you out of windows, stairwells. That.
Wow!
But so Andrew, I think I've taken enough of your time. Oh. I beg your pardon. They said, listen, it's an embarrassment to, you know, our friends are all, you know, one's got no idea of how those kind of things resonated. I mean, you know, the average white person, sort of middle class, which is sort of my background, you know, didn't, you know, that kind of stuff. I mean, at the student demonstrations, current at that time, just before Dirk Kemp had been arrested on the steps of St. George's Cathedral, that iconic picture of them dragging him by his hair. So that had all happened in the previous years, you know, guys like Jeff Budlander and so on. I think the general sentiment amongst not the sort of professional class, the sort of environment, the family environment that I came from, you know, the students are paid to go to university, not to fucking demonstrate steps of St. George's Cathedral. And my parents were not right wing by any means, but they said, no, fuck, if you've got time to be involved in this kind of shit, and by the way, you know, now you're in trouble with the police, and then you get a criminal record, and then you've got law, you know, that was the kind of thinking at the time. All of those things for my memoirs, but struggle of the revolution, by no means. So, you know, we were people. Difficult to see. I mean, it was a time that lost now because you know, liberal has become a dirty word again in this, certainly in this country. You know, which is a pity, because we've kind of veered towards the colonist type method of things in this country. You know, everything's dictated by the party cadres, and you know, that's the tail end of our year. So, but life carries on here. How long I'll carry on doing this, who knows? But it's an intellectual type profession. And you've got to, you know, one's gained a world of experience. Heard anything from Axel Kessler, by the way? He wasn't on the list Heights particularly, and he had this sort of dramatic, the dramatic kind of portrayal of these things. He'd just sort of capture the kind of moment in a lot of the, it was the poetry or or particularly Wuthering Heights. He'd sort of act out things, which and he was a completely anti-Aryan, if that's the word, sort of anti-establishment, and I think, and then you had next door, I think we were in next classroom next door was Mariki Besson, Louis Knutzer or Mariki Besson, I can't, but Louis Knutzer did teach us at some stage, and he was also a bit of an iconoclast, Yeah, John Ince did Chips type. All of those people, when I think back on them, I mean, it was never sort of, I can never think, no memory of saying, well, fuck, this is a drudge, I've got to go to school, type of thing. I mean, it was just kind of, I wouldn't say it was, I looked forward to every day, but it wasn't, it was a benign environment. Unique guy at a unique moment in history, and a very formative, I don't think one, certainly if I think back on my life, even, with the imperfections and, that's the human nature, perfect. I think, you kind of have this, all the bright guys, E1, tread carefully here, sort of guys who were clever, who were cut out to be the doctors, not so many ways, but you sort of the archetypal side, so there was no whiff of scandal, there was no sort of whiff of waywardness. These guys who came to, they did their work, they medical school, after 5 years they became doctors and lived happily ever after.